Wado, thank you. That was such a generous introduction, and I'm really grateful and honored to be able to be in conversation with you, Nicholas. We've known each other for a while, and in fact, one of the first ways that we were able to collaborate was through this performance that you see on the screen, which was part of an installation at the 2020 Sydney Biennale that was a work by a dear friend of ours named S.J. Norman. And the work was called Magna Mater. And 10 different Indigenous men and sort of masculine spectrum people recorded themselves brushing their hair. And that's a form of care that we are not often allowed. Hair was one of the first things that was cut when we were sent to boarding schools, or when assimilation was forced upon our communities. And so this act of care is a kind of radical decolonial movement towards being with, in a way. And as part of this installation, we agreed to brush each other's hair. And I'm brushing your hair there, and I remember being there. This was just before COVID sort of locked everything down. This was in March of 2020. And I think it was a kind of prescient moment in which care was something that we needed then, but we knew we were going to continue to need it, and we really have needed it. And so one of the things that I find in your work that runs throughout is a real intention to bring care for ancestors, care for the land, care for young people, care for craft, care for the form, care for memory. And I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about this moment, if you want, or about care and how you've thought about that over time.
Goodness, geez. Thank you. Thank you for being here and agreeing to be part of this. When I was speaking with Brandy about, what would be great, it was to have you here with us. So yeah, so it means a lot. Yeah, this was an interesting time. The Biennale of Sydney. I was out there with some of my family, installing work, and the world shifted. And I feel like we started to learn, for me anyways, I realized something that I think a lot of Indigenous communities already understand is community and how connected we truly are. And COVID showed a lot of that, I feel like, to everyone in the globe. Whether or not people took that as a learning experience, I don't know. But care for me and the work and my understanding of continuum were shown this in many lessons in our communities through how we care for elders, how we care for land and our families through harvesting. So immediately, everything that's embedded in at least my understanding of my practice is, tied to these things, to land, to those understandings and connection, I suppose. I feel like, I don't know.
So if we could maybe talk about some of the works in the show, one of the ones that really strikes me is you're doing such a good job, the video work. And there's an intergenerational aspect of that, and that's placed in the same room with the Indian children's bracelet, and that room is really difficult. It's a really challenging sort of constellation of works that that speak to harm that has been inflicted on us, and I think a lot of times in Native work in general, harm and violence can be a very common point of departure, right? Like we almost always feel like we have to start at this place of violence, colonialism or theft or dispossession or something like that. And some of your work does that, but also you have examples where, like Loom here, where it's actually reshaping that experience into something that is careful and is about caring for the memories that our ancestors hold, and so and also projecting that towards the future. So maybe you could just speak a little bit about what are some of your hopes relating to care about those works that are related together in the exhibition here.
Yeah, it is a heavy
Yeah.
space to enter in conversation, even an understanding of these histories. Of I've learned through navigating my practice in this world that a lot of these opportunities to create work allow for envisioned futures that are, we're not defined by trauma. We're not defined by these oppressive histories. And I know I've seen others speak on this in ways where that's actually more closely defined, it's a closer definition to those that have been doing the oppressive violence. And with this work, I'll start with the Indian children's bracelets. For me, there's something about scale in that is really important to understand. To understand to humanize it in a sense, and to do so with these generations that have been through this. For me, that work does a few things. There's an engraving on it that's very beautiful, and I've had this experience after creating that piece where people that were, like not from the communities or culture, a white man on social media, we should say. What's your band called? White Man on Social Media. Was upset. Was upset that the work was made. Was upset that the conversation was surfaced. And felt like they could say that I shouldn't be speaking on this or doing these things. That work has engraved visual language from our culture and our community. And as a jeweler trained in this work, I know the difference from how someone responds when I'm quiet and making something that might be decoratively beautiful, something that could be fetishized, or when I'm creating space for these experiences and stories to be understood and shared. And I think that work intentionally does that. The video work is language, with my partner and I's son, Atugani, responding to word affirmations, positive language of love and care that we've recorded and shared in our home. and it's not it seems like a simple thing, but when you layer it with these histories and this other conversation, for me, it's highlighting that we are doing this work still in our families, in our homes. It highlights also what was often removed from generations, from children that didn't get to hear those words when they were in a residential school or a boarding school, and it's not historic. Is another important aspect of this. It's now still. These generations are impacted continually. So.
No, I think the the way that if you look at these histories, these very difficult histories, one of the things that, you know, maybe our parents' generation or grandparents' generation, a lot of times they were prevented from caring for, right? Like the way that we have kinship bonds, the way that we have relations, the social fabric is disrupted, and one of the things that is targeted there is our ability to care for each other. And so that's why, for me, you know, that work in particular doesn't just historicize the experience of boarding schools or disruption of families, but actually offers everyone an opportunity to reflect on how we can recover forms of care. How can we reenact forms of care? And maybe it looks like spending time on a small scale and in your own family and learning, you know, the ways that we describe care. I remember the first time I learned how to say I love you in Cherokee language, "Gugayu-i," and like no one has ever said that to me, because my dad doesn't speak Cherokee. My grandma was forced to stop speaking Cherokee, right? Like, so how do we, and then at the same time, how do I start to feel what that means if I don't have the experience of that being said to me? So like there's an act of recovery and resistance that I think is really crucial in channeling that through a lens of care. It's not just like we need to care for each other, kumbaya bullshit. It's like it's a care that is really about enacting care on our own terms and in ways that are meaningful for us. And that wasn't a question. That was more like a rant.
This is why you're here, though.
So the rants are permitted, but I you know, you bring up scale. Scale is a thing that I think is really interesting in your work, because it you know, one of my sort of areas of study, and you can pick it up in the book that's over there with that's a signed copy, is about intimacy, right? The title of that book is about intimacy. So I care a lot about intimacy and intimate moments and small things and small moments, and you know, the children's bracelets are an example of really small moments, but you also have these really large interventions. And I think we can talk about those, you know, throughout. But to bring it back to one of the reasons why you were in Sydney before, there it is, perfect timing, was creating Shadow on the Land, which was a sort of an excavation of the shape of a Captain Cook statue in Australia. Can you talk about the relationship between some of these small scale things and some of the larger scale works that you're doing, like this one, in every language there is a land, right? Yeah.
Sure. The some of the larger scale work came through. Well, I come from a culture where we have monumental carvings that that was my initial training, I suppose, for large scale work. The the work that's directly working with land, I should say, in certain ways. So really started with the Desert X Biennial and Never Forget, and moving from there, I suppose. Intentionally using scale, referencing oftentimes existing scales of what's being held in the conversation. So the scale of shadow on the land in excavation and bush burial was to the scale of the shadow of the Cook Monument statue in Hyde Park. And the excavation of that shadow was to do a few things in that work. One, to work directly in the land. One, to dig deep enough to bury the monument. On the Cook statue in Hyde Park is a discovery plinth, colonial discovery plinth, and there's also a holiday to go with that, as you do. And I was aware of these things. It was like a 250th anniversary coming up. The irony of this work for me is that when you dig into the ground, you're going to find evidence of society that has been in this place. So utilizing something like archaeology and using the terms and the process to contradict the discovery narrative in that work while burying a monument is that work. So and then in every language there's land. In cada lengua hay una tierra is a work currently up with Public Art Fund in Brooklyn Park, and another conversation about land and migration and movement. The scale, again, was directly pulled from the border wall, the U.S.-Mexico border wall that is still going up, as maybe some of you have seen Biden pushing through the continuance of this construction. So, yeah, scale oftentimes works directly with existing forms of material and scale. Never Forget was the scale of the Hollywood land sign, 1-to-1, so 44-foot tall letters, which was originally put up as a white-only real estate land advertisement. That's where the Hollywood land sign originated. So, yeah.
So I think scale also is something that Indigenous cosmologies teach us a lot about. We're often, if you look at origin stories, we're often not there at the beginning. It's animals and plants that are first, and humans come after. In many stories, maybe not in all stories, but in many. And we're often like the helpless ones, and we have to learn a lot. We're often smaller in scale, and our star stories and our star knowledge teach us of our reduced scale in relationship to the cosmos. And then there's the scale of colonialism, right? And as a global sort of enactment of Indigenous dispossession that's predicated on theft of land and theft of children and theft of all these kinds of things, right? And so the scale of the response to that also has to be commensurate with the scale of colonialism. And I think that's one of the things that your work also points out, right? Like we can go from these really intimate things, but then you're confronted, and like I live in New York, and so when I go from Brooklyn to Manhattan, I see that sculpture. You can see it from the train, and I think that's actually a really interesting thing to I look out the window, and there it is, like in Brooklyn Bridge Park, and then it disappears, and I go on my way, right? But it's a work that is large, but also allows for different types of relationships to happen. We were talking with Brandy the other day, and people have picnics on that sculpture. People people do all kinds of things and hang on it and take pictures of it, and it's in a place where people are constantly enacting with it. Moments of tenderness, moments of intimacy that happen right there, and whether or not people are aware of or are like conscientiously enacting that in that place, you've created an environment at such a scale to where the grandness of that piece can actually contain other types of intimacies, which I think is also really interesting, right? Like how the scale can open and contract at different points. I don't know, do you want to say anything about like the placement of that and that?
Yeah, certainly. I feel like a lot of this work, like many, you have to experience in person oftentimes, and with that work in particular, there's a few things that can happen with it. You can pass through it, so it's not just a barrier. In this case, the material was diverted from the construction, so this would have been a portion of the wall, and it's now here, and it's holding space and room for conversations about land, about the history of land, about movement and migration. And in a place like New York and Brooklyn, this conversation, which I've a large part of my research and stuff as it was preparing for this project, and even speaking with some of the Lenape, was that how overshadowed New York's modern history is with migration and other things over just the Lenape's period of time in history. And so for me, I feel like the joy of a work like this is that everybody has a stake in it, and everyone has an understanding of how they got here, and we can share those stories with work like that. So
we've gotten to the part of the program that's called critique, and I kind of snuck it in there, but as you can tell, like a lot of these the large scale things, but then for example the newspaper print of the return of Manhattan, right, thinking of Lenape and Lenapehoking as this mythic sail to settlers, and then what would it look like if that were returned. There's also a relationship there with in every language there is land, right, about the return of Manhattan to Lenape people. That's done on the scale of a newspaper print, right? And I think that dialogue is really interesting too. But I want to take those two examples and ask a little bit more specifically about the role of critiquing systems, critiquing colonialism, critiquing, and this also gets to a lot of your work that's about critiquing objects that are held in museums, objects that are fetishized by colonial institutions. So how do you conceptualize the different forms of critique in your work, and how do you kind of pivot to respond to the different types of political and economic sort of events that are happening in the world?
I love seeing all of this work together here. This is the first time I feel like a lot of these pieces have been in conversation, and everything really is connected in a conversation together. So the world clock, which you reference with the New York Times, is connected to these other conversations in many ways. Indigenous artists, almost by default, if you're working in continuum, you're immediately forced to navigate institution. You're immediately, if you want to access your community's cultural objects, or if you want to even access all there's knowledge that's been homogenized through academia. You still have to enter these institutional spaces, and from the get-go, those relationships were something that I had to understand, even if I didn't want to, so critiquing the inability for these systems to care for our community, our people, our objects, our land, our water, it seemed like a good place to do it. It's in the same spaces that hold these things. So,
I think there's a one of the things that I find interesting about your work, and as I mentioned with regard to care, is it's not just about pointing out a lack of care, but providing methods of returning to care. And I think there's a similar operation that's happening with critique. It's not just look at all of our things that were stolen. It's look at how we can care for those things that have been stolen, or prevent things from getting stolen, or get some of those things back. So what are some of your sort of ulterior motives for critiquing some of these things? Tell us.
Yeah. Instagram likes, and, hashtags. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, sovereignty, land back, all of our ancestral remains and objects back. A seat at the table in these spaces that don't have us or allow for us to be even existing or sharing our conversations in these spaces. And survival and continuing process of our culture and our knowledge, leaving this with more than what we arrived at. So
I think we can also make reference to the title of the show, and Brandy mentioned a little bit of that in our introduction, but I think one of the through lines here too is about interference or disruption, and there's a theoretical background there. There's a lot of thought that goes into creating work that allows us to think about how to disrupt the sort of status quo. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you reach critique through some of these strategies like disruption, interference. I'm thinking maybe of signal disruption, American Prayer Rug, right? Like there's works that directly reference this, but they allow us to take stock of our own thought process, and sometimes they ask us to stop and rethink things. So can you walk us through a little bit some of these themes of disruption and of interference?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with purchase, which is the copper lockpicks. If you get a chance to walk through the exhibition, there's a little plinth in this room back here with hand engraved copper lockpicks. So copper in my culture is it's a metal that held value in our community pre-colonial contact. It was a material that was used to distribute wealth or to break it. The lockpicks have text hand engraved on them. The text was collection notes while I was at the American Museum of Natural History and the archives, because that's what we do. We dig through museums, archives, and just to access our culture, and the provenance, the text, the notes, the verbiage, or the words that were utilized to say how an object got somewhere or how it didn't. Some things were purposefully not documented, but the words were like collected from a shaman's grave. That's not collection. That's theft, and that's not just objects. It's also remains, etc. So for that work, it ties directly to architecture of return escape, which is the Hyde paintings. Oh, here we go with blueprints, architectural drawings of floor plans to institutions. These institutions are ones that hold our objects, our remains, in their collections still. This is a way finding, the map is a source of finding a way, not just a way out, a way to care, and a way to care for our communities, a way to care for the objects beyond humidity, temperature control, spiritually to care. Oftentimes, and it will be, it's mentioned in some of these other concepts of the work, is that our communities are, as in the imaginary Indian totem, purposefully removed or forgotten, and all that really. The goal of that, I suppose, is to just have our objects and not us, or just have our land without us. So,
and the Museum of Natural History is such a fucked place. It's interesting. I mean, back in the day, we used to go protest there on Columbus Day, which is coming up, and it would be interesting to be in that place in a form of protest, and all of the work that has to go into sort of like containing the Indians that would go to like protest the fact that our objects are held in these museums. I mean, the Museum of Natural History in New York was founded as a ethnographic museum that was started with grave robbers, right? Like all of the first collections were indigenous remains that were looted from graves, and a lot of ethnographic museums were started like that. So, what does it mean that the origin stories to a lot of these types of American museums, not just in the US, like all over the Americas and in Europe, are started on the basis of stolen human remains? That origin persists through collection practices that you allow you to recognize as, again, with care, not just something of the past, not just something that existed in that moment of the inception of the museum, but also that these objects and these remains are still alienated from the communities that need them, that need to care for them, and whose care those objects that aren't objects also need. So, the Architecture of Return series, let me tell you a quick another anecdote. Okay, so I'm an academic, and one of my colleagues is a specialist in Italian marble sculpture, and he's a very great colleague, and this is no slight against him. But he took all of his students to the Met to go see some Italian sculptures. And I learned about this, and I thought, okay, yeah, you went to the Met, okay, that's good. So then I got to show them Nicholas's Architecture of Return map of the Met. That is a map of how to get the objects, not necessarily the ones that they were looking at, but the ones right next to the ones that they were looking at, back. And this juxtaposition, I think, allows us to reconsider what we do when we go to those spaces, how we enter them, how those spaces have served in many instances, in most instances, to objectify and to sort of position us as always, relics of the past. But what you demonstrate is that we have ongoing responsibilities to those objects. So that brings me, right, we're between kind of critique and return here. So what is it that you hope for with the Architecture of Return series? Like, tell us a little bit more about your thought process with that.
There's so many institutions. There's more of these that haven't been done yet.
Literally,
that
all
need
of
to
them.
be done. Yeah, but everything has to be returned. Period. Has to. I was just at the British Museum's archives and looking at masks from my community, and obviously it's very difficult to get anything repatriated from the British Museum. Well, the conversation that's being had right now is we'll send the mask from our community back to a climate-controlled institution that can, so the community can visit it.
They literally say you aren't capable of caring for it.
Exactly.
LOL.
Yes. So the project that might happen, that's like seeking some funding and stuff right now, is to recreate it to sit in the museum and to train an apprentice, a younger carver, to also learn and do that work. And for me, the reality of this, can you care for it or not? And if you see the intellectual property, the work in the space here, here we are. These are materials. These are materials that our communities know how to harvest, handle, and to create ceremonial objects that connect us to our history, that connect us to supernatural. The care are the reality is that we hold that knowledge and we pass it on in continuum, and that's where it continues to live, and that's how we exist beyond just these cases or these spaces that freeze us in a time period. That Architecture of Return work is not just caring for us or the objects. Everyone will be in a better place when that happens. So,
I mean, and architecture, I think I love that title, but the concept of architecture I think is interesting too, because it actually reminds us of the infrastructural nature of a lot of the colonial things.
yeah, it's not just the building, it's the system and the architecture of society and power structure.
Yeah, and so it gets us thinking about systems as opposed to singular moments in which a lot of institutions can say, oh, look, we returned the one thing to the one people, now we're good, right? It's not about that. Great, thanks, but it's about how you operate as a system that is predicated on the continued theft of our objects and our people.
There's a relationship, and there's maintenance, and there's things that have to be continued in all of our communities in general. And for these spaces, the way forward is to definitely focus on those communities immediately, I believe.
No, I was thinking about intellectual property too, and there's an irony, right, to that title, and it isn't just intellectual, and it isn't just property, and when we think about the materiality, and a lot of your work is very materially grounded, and you're an expert at multiple crafts and the technique that you engage in a lot of these things, but that is part of a broader system of knowledge, right? You don't just go out and cut down a tree, right? It's about caring for the tree and being in relationship with the tree and the land and being in relationship with the whole process, right? So this isn't a process question so much as, can you talk about the layers that go into creating the intellectual property?
Certainly, when we carve in our community a kutia, a totem pole, it's you thank the tree people, you bless the tree, you work with elders to protocol for understanding the what's going to be represented image-wise and clan crest wise on a kutia. It's an entirely involved process of beyond a material. It's a community, it's history, it's in continuum of, I think of it as life work, because I believe it takes a lifetime to just participate in it. And I feel like when we speak of materials in these other conversations, it includes those.
And the the materials there are, I mean, I think here we run up to like a kind of a limitation of the language, right? Because yeah, it's a material, but it's also more than that. And when we think about objects, it's not just an object, right? And this is part of the system thinking that your work invites us to do, to not just say, this is a beautiful object, but it's an object that is more than that because of the sum of its processual parts, right? The process allows us to say that there's much more going on here. And that's connected to being in good relations with community, with relatives, with all kinds of things. I think I just restated what you just said.
It was really good.
Was it good? And so, okay, thinking about returning things and thinking about that the act of providing pathways for rethinking what constitutes creativity, what constitutes intellectual property. One of the things that I think is really challenging is, when we think about return, it's sometimes not easy to actually determine what the right pathway is for return, or what the right protocols are, or what the right method is for getting something back. Not just because of the infrastructure built up around all of these objects, but because we're not in a pre-colonial time, right? Like, we're in now. And I wonder if you could talk about the way that you think about return, not to this like imagined pure past, but return to now.
I would like to go back to conversations of kutia and totem poles in this return, and in our community's monumental visual language carved into red cedar, or will return to the land after it's stood long enough in its spot where it came from, like our bodies. And I feel like the contrast of that to this belief of like, let's poison and conserve a material with arsenic and catalog it in anthropological, museological context is very, very different understandings of existence. And the having the understanding that the power and knowledge of these systems and communities is not just in that. It's in the people that come from that culture. It's in the generations of continuum that share knowledge, and it survives that way.
I was just seeing the slide of infinite weight, and one of the things that, because I've seen all of these different pieces in different places, but to see them all here together and the way that they're staged or the way that they're combined has given me a new appreciation for a lot of them, but also the layout and the lighting design. There's a lot of play with shadows here in this space, which I found really, really interesting. And a lot of your work also has to do with like shadow on the land, right? And I wonder if you could talk about the particularity of some of the ways in which the exhibition is set up here. I was thinking about lighting, but you might, have another idea about what's special about the way it's set up here.
Well, it's special because of the lighting staff here, incredible. Sculptural work allows for lighting, I feel like, and so I love to see work like value of sharpness when it falls in the intro of the hatchets.
Amazing.
This is an incredible opportunity to share work in a space like this, and to have work that can, spill into the walls, into the space with movement. Even the sun moves through that space a little bit, so the shadows will move. I love seeing the shadow of the wolf in infinite weight in this installation. There's been shadows included in imaginary Indian works in the past, not necessarily this installation, but there was one at the Victoria Art Museum in Canada that had a shadow that was cast, and the silhouette looked like a human from the totem, and that was a really interesting conversation, I think, with the concept of the work. But
In the value of sharpness, I remember the first time I saw that work, it was in Brooklyn in a really small gallery, or it was like a shoebox. I don't know what it was. It was like a garage.
it was open source gallery.
Open source
Yeah,
gallery.
it was a very small space.
Very small. And it was, I think it was lower than it is here, and everyone had to duck.
I think you were like weaving in and out. Yeah.
You had to weave in and out from to avoid getting hatcheted. But I think the way that it's set up here is really dynamic, and I like the interplay of the shadows on the walls, and it's a really beautiful install here. But can you tell us a little bit about some of another juxtaposition there between the sharpness or the kind of the function of a hatchet,
Sure,
and the delicateness of the decoration there?
I feel like it's important to mention here too that light as a when woodcarver, light is another tool, and whether it's how you position it while you're working, or whether it's how it's utilized from the sharing of installation of a work. I think it's another tool of sorts. I love that the glow from the neon is at the entrance of the space. There's a version of that work that is up at the Seattle Art Museum. Neon American Anthem White is what it's called at the Seattle Art Museum, and it's a completely different piece, even though it's the same text, and it's So I love how light is able to do these things. Value of sharpness when it falls is a conversation around the inadequate colonial tools provided to indigenous communities to survive, to navigate the world. and those are represented in the form of a tool, a hatchet that might be used for protection or for sustenance, survival, and it shatters upon its intended use. So the value of that is actually not in what they've provided, it's in the shards of it breaking. So, and
That's great. Do you, since the red version of the neon work is a new commission, do you want to tell us a little bit about what's special about this one?
yeah, there's going to be 3. So they're obvious. It's working with national color scheme, national palette.
Okay.
I like to work with a presidential palette when I work with neon. So the neon American anthem white with green welcome mats, the artificial turf with the little daisies, very generic welcome mat. And then this has the red ones, and there's a blue version that hasn't been installed or isn't created yet. But the work originated from a call or invitation to reimagine the contemporary art gallery space at the Seattle Art Museum, which largely excluded us until the invitation to like fix it for them. Which is a thing, I guess. So, yeah. And for me, the work that neighbors that gallery is our cultural objects from our community are literally next door to it. So anthropology and then this contemporary space. It's a composition, a song, and the song is a scream. And it's a scream until you can't breathe, you lose your breath, and it fills that space and those halls with that song. So, and invites everyone to participate.
You know, we experienced, for those of you who were here at the opening last night, you would have experienced some of that. And I remember the different tones of people's voices, the different pitches of people's voices when it was one person versus groups of people who would decide to scream together. I wasn't necessarily expecting of groups of people deciding that together we were going to do this. And I wonder if you could talk about the way that work invites a kind of collective response, not just an individual one.
The scale, I feel like, does the broad language in it is it's I've realized, as you know, when a work lives on after it's been created or shared, you learn things about it, and you learn things about people's engagements with it that you can never predict. And this work, I've learned people from all perspectives, political backgrounds, this or that, relate to it in certain ways. And it's interesting to watch as a broad swoop of, in this, there's some nationalism in this idea of an anthem. And so everybody's stake in their political identity or their voice or no voice in it is invited in this, I feel like.
When you think about that, it's the fact that it's not the first thing you see. It's I guess the second thing you see, but the light bleeds out into the opening gallery there, and I think that there's a really powerful connection between the presentness of that, the ongoingness of that, and also again, and maybe this is just something that's stuck in my head, but how anthem refers back to a sort of the foundation of nation states, and how the symbols that nations invent are ways of coalescing around certain ideas, ideologies, certain identities, and the scream in response to that, until you have no more breath, is a cacophonous response to the idea, to the concept of the United States. Like, what response could there possibly be to this place, right? Like,
Yeah. The contrast of "Please stand for the national anthem" to "Invitation to take a knee" or to kneel, and how we've seen that through protest, or you see it through prayer, you see it through, I feel like that's an important part of this as well. Conversations of, even now, my nephew, who's, I don't know, 3rd or 4th grade, is aware of, the histories of the atrocities of nation building, and refused to stand for Pledge of Allegiance in his school, and I feel like these are still conversations that are impacting our communities in different ways. So.
I mean, it kind of brings it full circle in look at my timing there. It brings it full circle, and we think about nation building and nationalism, and how a lot of that is predicated on a type of erasure, at least in the context of the United States, an erasure of indigenous presence in order to create an American identity, but which oftentimes still harnesses that indigenous presence, but as a caricature, or as an object in a museum, or as a kind of past that has to always be overcome in order for us who are the new Americans are.
And this ties into the title of "In Every Language There's Land," in cada lengua hay una tierra, is 2 colonial languages on 2 sides of a colonial scar, or a barrier or wall, that cross many indigenous languages, many indigenous people, many indigenous cultures, and I feel like that's touches on some of this as well.
I think if we could try to put some of these strands together, one of the reasons that I mean, we all have our own personal histories, right? Like my family has histories of land loss through infrastructure projects, right? Our allotment land was flooded when they built a dam, and my dad was, removed from his family through an adoption process. And we have all of these scars. The scars can be intimate and personal. The scars can be infrastructural, like a wall, like a border wall. Or like the wall of Wall Street in New York, which was literally built to keep out the Lenape people. And so I think it brings us back finally to the question of, how do we imagine these histories in ways that allow for a return of the objects, a return to care, and a return to our forms of relating and engaging with each other and with the broader landscape, that provides for a bit of inspiration, hope, joy, even joy, and that is something that you don't often see in contemporary works of art. I think you've got so much complexity in that, and I want to thank you for helping all of us think through that with this.
Goodness, sheesh.
Yeah.